all companies that I either started or was involved in the sale or the end of. A couple that I bought along the way. I've had a 15-year career as an entrepreneur. I had kind of an interesting start. I'll get into that later. And prior to that, in about 2006, I actually started a business right out of school. You can't see it really well because it's blurry in the upper left-hand corner, but it's called Bigger Mock Productions. It was a combination of my friend's name and my name, and we formed a video production company and sold a video to Cal, to Berkeley, our alma mater. And that was my first experience registering a business and handling money in a business and all that sort of stuff. Fast forward a few years, my brother and I started Schaaf Consulting. We bought another company called Partner Centric that became Schaaf Partner Centric. We couldn't think of a better name. There were a couple failed attempts along the way. You can see that bike called Split a Cab. That was, it was not a pro version of Uber, but it was sort of the ride sharing idea that a friend of ours had, and it never got off the ground. So sort of failure to launch will kind of be a part of this presentation as well. Ditto Trademark. Trademark actually did get built. So it kind of got launched, but it never got anywhere. And that one's a little bit more interesting because other companies that had that exact same business model later came into the marketplace and are still around today. In fact, one got sold earlier this year. Schaaf Partner Centric also bought some other companies and books of business, including that company PMG, and then to kind of go over to FMTC. We bought a company a couple of years ago called Copelia, and FMTC launched those below companies, one of which was sold and one of which was shuttered. So, you know, those are all starts and stops. And at the very far right, you can see Prep Dish Personal Chef. That's a personal chef business that my wife owns. I do not own it, but I helped her sell it. So it's in this presentation. Let's back up and ask the question, what is a small business anyway? It's worth noting that there's actually no fixed definition of small business. The closest thing you probably get would be the Small Business Administration, and its definition varies. There's hundreds of codes for your company. You can see I looked one up randomly for orange groves, and they have a little wizard on their site. So if you have an orange grove that's doing $1 million a year in revenue, yes, you qualify as a small business. And this is relevant because it affects financing that you can get in federal or other government contracts that you'll be eligible for. Otherwise, some people would typically say, I think, you know, if you ask the average person, they'd say under 50, under 100 people, but in the grand scheme of things, it's more like under 1,000 or under 1,500 people and under $5 or $10 million a year. This does not, I don't mean this to sound bad, but it would be kind of something that would be quote unquote invisible to the larger economy. You know, if Facebook went away, you would notice it. You know, if General Motors went away, you'd notice it. If my company went away, you wouldn't notice it unless you do business with me. This company Overlow, which I'm not super familiar with them, I don't have any connection to them, but they have some nice slides that I kind of pulled out. You know, I think it's a good reminder of the scope of things. This actually, the small business group that I'm a part of, it's part of the Office of the National Ombudsman. They referenced these slides in a presentation we had last week. So just under 31 small businesses in the US. They create millions of jobs every year, and it's really fascinating to me that the majority of jobs are created by small businesses, and I think that's been true as long as I've been alive. And it really makes a lot of sense. There's sort of, you know, laboratories. There's just so many of them. Again, not quite as visible except in the aggregate. And you know, I think this is the one's a little bit skewed because again, it's skewed by the number of how many small businesses there are compared to large businesses. But suffice it to say, it's a really important part of our economy, and it could be, you know, a very important part of your life. So on that note, that's a good segue to why start a small business. Now, of course, you could start a small business, or you could buy a small business. This is from a company called Guidance. They did some kind of survey, and you know, they said the most likely reason was to be your own boss. This is not quite my experience. I think the most likely reason that you enter the small business world as an owner is you are clueless, and you eventually go from being clueless to being hard-boiled. And I don't know if anybody remembers this movie, but it was a Hong Kong action movie from the 90s. And I just think for purposes of this presentation, it's perfect the guy is holding a baby, because the small business is like your baby. Exits, I didn't find a survey for this one. There probably are ones out there you can kind of look out. But when I thought about my personal experience and I looked up some stuff people had, there's a few really common reasons, right? You might get bored with what you're doing, or just like burnout. You might not like the role, so you started a small business as the craftsman and now you're like the big boss and you hate being the big boss. I know a guy actually has an SEO business out of Philadelphia. He fired himself as the CEO and now he's like the evangelist. And so he's all over, LinkedIn and does a good job with that, but he didn't like the executive role, which can be hard to stay away from when you're the owner. Sometimes you get an offer. Sometimes that offer is out of the blue. And oftentimes there's a business life cycle issue that kind of comes up. So this company, BCMS, again, I don't have a relationship with these guys. Stuff accumulates over the years. And I thought that this was a really good, very on point sort of diagram about a typical life of a small business. And the idea is that like, if you get a business and it kind of gets wings and it flies up, I've observed that every business kind of has, if it makes it, it's it phase. And so like within your industry, like you're the business, like you're the agency that everybody's talking about for a while. And then that fades away. And when it fades away, it doesn't mean your business has stopped growing or is failing or anything like that. It just means you've kind of gone from the foreground to the background. And I would argue that that's even true with massive corporations like Google or Facebook. Like they're just so big that they're a part of your everyday life. You sort of just breathe them in. They're not something that was, like a movie that caught your attention for a while. And whatever happens kind of past that it phase, it could go different ways, right? It could plateau as well. So this is a little bit dramatized, but the reinvestment might be a reinvestment in energy. It could be a reinvestment in capital. But the decay or decline stage is very real. Now, of course, if you're the small business owner and you're looking to exit, you want it to be on the uptrend because a potential buyer would, avoid the stench of death, so to speak. So this is something to be very kind of advised of. You can still exit. That's been a lot of my experience when people do want to leave for those reasons. But then if you're the buyer, of course, you're left kind of, you have to be the one to do that reinvestment or breathe new life into it. You see a lot of stats like this about the high failure rate of small businesses, 95% in the first 5 years. I would take this with a grain of salt because I've always wondered, I've never found this out, but I've always wondered if that's not based on business registrations, because there's a gazillion businesses that get registered as like legal entities that nothing ever happens, right? No bank accounts ever created, et cetera. And I don't know how they would determine if those have failed or not. But I got a buddy and he's a restaurant owner. He made it to this magical 2-year mark. And I said, hey, you made it, and he was starting to do new stuff. And I said, hey, why do new stuff? He made it to the 2-year mark. And like, most restaurants fail by that point. And he said, well, they don't then magically stay in business forever. You got to have something new. The vast majority are going to be gone, after 5 years, after 10 years, et cetera. So you do need to kind of get a feel for your business and, what it's like long-term likelihood is going to be. But that said, I think statistics like these can be overly discouraging, because when you kind of get in and sort of play the game a little bit, you'll naturally get a feel for the marketplace. You're thinking of entering, you're thinking of buying something, you're thinking of leaving, selling, or of course you could just be shutting down. What would you be doing here? And I broke this into preparation, discovery, financing, valuation, negotiating, and legal, and emotional, not to be overlooked. The preparation phase could totally be its own presentation of probably many hours. I mean, you could probably go to a 3-day seminar on this. I included some things that sort of been salient to me in my career. So one thing is your marketplace is going to have certain marketplace conditions, right? So is it a cyclical business? Are you selling Halloween costumes or Christmas trees? Is the market very fragmented? So the space that I come from, which is affiliate marketing, which is basically a form of online advertising, we are still today very fragmented. So my company FMDC now is we sell data basically, in particular coupon data. We track a lot of the players in the space. There's over 200 agencies in our space. That includes big guys and small guys. So that's really fragmented. It's not like a handful of car companies or one power company or something like that. And when the industry is fragmented, that I think typically means that there's a lot more opportunity over time, because there'll be some consolidation opportunities, or you could always just enter as a new player. It's typically very possible to enter a market with your angle as an agency. By agency, I mean a company that has humans doing some kind of labor, usually, information work in our economy. Somebody who's buying, is going to want to look at your position in the marketplace. Do you have market share? Do you have concentration risk? How's your customer retention? Do you have connections in the ecosystem? So we bought a company that was another agency years ago, and they had eBay as a client, which was a massive, massive client for them. It was worth tens of thousands of dollars a month in billings. And that single client was such a big part of the deal that we actually got, with the permission of the seller, we got a conversation with them to say, hey, is this relationship stable? Because it expires at the end of the year. And that, sort of worked out. But that obviously is going to be a huge risk for any buyer. And frankly, even if you're not considering selling, if you're if you have some kind of company and somebody's, one client's more than 20% is the usual number, it probably varies by industry, but if somebody's more than 20% of your revenue, you got to watch out, because that could sink you if they go away. And some businesses are strange, right? They have like literally one client that they serve. So, buyers can of course be very tuned into all this. And then also ecosystem connections. That's kind of a soft value that's not to be overlooked. Slack, I saw sold to Salesforce for over $27 billion, which really blew me away. And I don't track the big sales so much, but that's sure a lot of money. And some of the commentary on that I saw was that, Slack has just thousands and thousands of integrations, which is hugely, hugely valuable, because it, makes things frictionless if you want to connect to different software systems that you're paying for. So there's also those soft human connections in the ecosystem too. Your relationship with company X, you're an approved vendor for company Y, et cetera. The operating agreement may sound a little bit dry. This is something that I could talk quite a lot about as well. But I have learned from personal painful experience that if you are in business with a partner, now you need this even if you don't have a partner, but you can, if you're the sole owner, you can distract it yourself pretty quickly. But if you're a partner, you really have to, one or more partners, you have to know who has ultimate control, right? Because if you have a 50-50 partnership, what do you do if you're at loggerheads, which is a situation I've been in personally. Or if you have no operating agreement, how do you make decisions? How would you ever be able to sell? And the sooner you can do something like that, the better. And there's a lot of tough questions to ask along those lines too. So a couple classic additional points are, for sale, is there what's called a shotgun clause or drag along, tag along. And what those mean are, the shotgun clause would be like, hey, if Stephanie and I had a business together and I said, hey, I really want to sell, and she said, hey, I don't, I would be able to force a sale. So the idea would be I would hold a shotgun to her head, and I quote a price, and she has to either buy me out at that price or sell to me at that price, so that I can go and do something else. Now, hypothetically speaking, there wouldn't need to be somebody to buy. I could just execute the shotgun clause because we didn't want to, be in business anymore or something like that. Not a pleasant discussion to have under most circumstances, but things are going to change if you're in business with somebody over the years. The drag along, tag along is a little bit more obscure, but what that means is somebody else kind of comes in to buy, and let's say Stephanie and Silk and I are in a business together, and one of us is, a 10% minority shareholder, and somebody buys us and they can get controlling interest, but they don't want to have like some 10% holder. That would give them the right to buy that person out. That's the drag along. Or conversely, if the acquirer has no interest in buying them out, they don't want to have some stump portion of a business that they have no control over. They would have the right to tag along. So there's some other standard elements, but you really want to have a good operating agreement. That would be something to put together with a lawyer, because there's some employee or something and they get promised equity or phantom equity, but it's not on paper, and it causes a big kerfuffle later when the business is sold. You don't want to have your paperwork out of order. That can torpedo the business. The management team, if you have a going concern is doing some amount of money and somebody buys your company, you typically would have some earnout period or some consulting period or something like that. The buyer would typically want to know that there's a really solid management team in place. So when my brother and I sold the agency, we actually sold it to the manager. So we actually sold it to the woman who was the CEO at the time, and she had a whole intact structure. That makes it a lot easier to do the sale because the buyer will be worried about it falling apart. And again, even if you don't have a buyer, that's something you probably want to have in place in case you get hit by a bus or become incapacitated or something else happens. Board of directors, I've actually never done as much with. It's considered best practice, so I kind of threw it in there. Probably should be on its own sort of standalone bullet point. For smaller businesses, they frankly tend to be advisory boards. Maybe they're compensated, maybe they're not. Sometimes it's kind of for equity that, usually does not turn into something. It's not like you're an early advisor for, Google or Facebook or something like that. So that one I've never really played around with as much. I have had advisory boards before, but it is something worth noting that some, and if you do have it, they could also help you to sell. A buddy of mine, he had a company, and he and his partner didn't keep books. They just they had a bank account, and all the money went into the bank account, and they would leave a certain amount in as operating cash, and then just take the rest out. It was an events company, so it was they would just do it a certain number of times, and that totally worked for them for years. But when they finally did sell the business, they had to go back and recreate the books. So they did not get away with that ultimately. So this represents discovery. If you have a business that you want to sell, how does somebody discover you, or how do you find the buyer? And if you want to buy a business that's out there, how do you find it? I don't have as much experience with this, frankly. I have had a number of friends who've sold businesses with brokers, with investment bankers. My own sales have been through the community and through competitors. So the stuff we started was, like the split a cap thing, that was through a family friend that we had. And the trademark thing that I mentioned, and those were both unsuccessful. That one was through we reached out to a friend of my brother's to do like the development work. And that actually ended up not working because it moved too slowly, because it was a part-time project. So that's something else to kind of keep in mind. In most businesses that you would sell, they will be to somebody who kind of knows your space, right? And I think that would probably be true of, like a restaurant, probably be true of an agency, probably be true if you had some manufacturing business. They would know you, they would know your business. They would probably pay less than other people potentially would, which I'll get into a little bit later. But that's often a very good sort of trust-bound conversation that you can have. And that also enabled us to do a deal once. So when we bought one of the agencies, we did it as a seller-held note because we couldn't get bank financing. This was right after 2008's crash. And I remember we went to like this one banker, and he said, "Well, I can't guarantee that this will work out, but." And then he leans in, and he's like, "I guarantee it." And of course, it doesn't work out. And we tried talking to 7 banks. It's a real disadvantage of agencies. There's no collateral, there's no inventory, there's no land, there's no buildings. So the bank doesn't really have much it can collect on. So we did, because we developed a good relationship of trust over the years, a seller-held note with the woman who owned that business. We paid her off on time with interest, and it worked out really well for both sides because she wanted to get out. The classic way, though, I think to really do it is to get an investment banker. So a buddy of mine, he had a business. It was sort of a software company in the higher educational space. He actually did this twice. And they did the whole thing where you get an investment banker, and they do a whole big book for you. They reach out to a lot of people. Actually, I got some stats from this company, BCMS, that was on that slide earlier. They said that they reach out to 150 to 250 potential buyers for you. From that, they'll yield 4 to 10 serious candidates. So a big drop off, of course. They'll get 4 to 6 bids, and they'll see a spread of 2x from the lowest to the highest bid. And based on my friend shared quite a lot with me, and based on what he shared, that sounds pretty true. So again, I haven't done this myself, but it really seems like if you have an investment banker, they can really shop your deal and find a strategic buyer who would be willing to pay more. Now, the challenge with that is if you have, that's a business that's sold for tens of millions of dollars. If you have a business that's selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars or like low millions of dollars, it might be tough to do that because the percentage could be quite high as a percentage of the total deal. They might have minimum fees or things like that. And of course, they might not be interested in your deal. So I get calls all the time because these companies have, research teams, right? So typically younger employees, interns sometimes, and they just call companies all day long, every day. And they're usually looking for companies that are over 10 million. And I'll usually talk to them and also, but what I say now is I say, hey, listen, happy to chat, but just so you know, my company's under 10 million in annual revenue. And that usually stops the conversation right there, so I'm not wasting their time and they're not wasting my time. But it does seem to be a best practice if you have a business of a certain size. Maybe it's not 10 million, but it's probably like 5 million or more in loose numbers. So again, there's not ironclad rules, but that's sort of what I've seen, what I've heard, what people have said to me. Lastly, in reverse order, we come back to brokers. So a buddy of mine had a business, a really old school business in the construction space that he did really well with. He modernized it. He brought in modern manufacturing and stuff that had been done by hand previously, and was then kind of looking for something new to start. And I was asking him like, well, hey, how do you find businesses? And he said, well, basically I just subscribe to all these broker lists. So I think there's like 50 brokers lists, tons of different industries. And he just sees what comes through because there's no MLS that I'm aware of, at least for small business sales. I mean, there are marketplaces certainly, but that's, going to be specific stuff. It's not for everything. And he was really a really strong due diligence guy. So he would really kind of want to make sure he saw everything. Like in my space, there's a company called Hello Exit. They do online businesses. So if you had some kind of .com, maybe it's a retailer, maybe it's an info site, maybe it's a publisher, he would potentially put that company up for sale. And I just happened to have met him because, he's kind of in my space and he talks at conferences and stuff. There's probably guys like that in every industry, I would imagine. I picked this slide because for valuation, I think the fantasy, if you have a small business and you want to sell it, is that you'll get retirement money. And I like this one because, the value of these coins does not add up to retirement dollars. And I think that the vast majority of the time, your small business realistically is not going to be worth retirement money. Now, what is retirement money? To each his own, I suppose. But I think most people would say it's, north of north of $10 million if they're living a high consumption lifestyle, spending a lot of money, which a lot of entrepreneurs do, of course. And the typical small business would be worth, some fraction of that. So for example, I would stake a valuation formula of a typical agency. And again, I talk about agencies a lot because that was what I did most of my professional career as an entrepreneur. If you have an agency and it's doing $1 million a year in billing revenue, so not media spend, but the actual billing revenue, then like that would be like billable hours, et cetera. And it's making, call it a 15% profit margin. And somebody was willing to pay, for 3 years profit rounded up, which I think would be a pretty reasonable basis. You'd be at about 50%. So that agency would be worth about half of its top line billing on an annual basis. And having done these deals, again, on the buy and the sell side, I found that to be a pretty good guideline. And so, by that math, you need for the $10 million sale, you want a $20 million agency, which would be quite massive. Now, just to note, I have heard from people who've done bigger deals that when you cross that threshold, 10, 50 million, the multiplier goes up from say a 0.5 to maybe a 1 or even a 1.5. And that, again, anchors pretty well to the famous EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, deduction, and amortizations, which is, for simplicity's sake, call it net profit. So that's something to keep in mind. You want to have realistic expectations. One thing not to overlook if you're selling or buying is owner addbacks, which is to say that typically a small business owner will run a lot of personal expenses that are eligible for deduction, but that a business wouldn't normally incur. And the most infamous example of this is probably meals. So the IRS doesn't fight you on meals, but they only let you deduct 50%. I think after so many decades of people doing this, travel, people buy cars for themselves, all sorts of stuff. And so a savvy buyer should know to do those as addbacks, and a savvy seller should know to do the same. There's also the famous strategic versus financial buyer. So I've mostly been a financial buyer. I've said, well, what's the investment here? What's the payback period? And by and large, it's worked out pretty well. And I've also sold that way typically, as opposed to a strategic buyer. And a great example of that would be Facebook buying WhatsApp or Instagram. Huge purchases, right? I think, WhatsApp was in the neighborhood of like $20 billion or something. Instagram seemed like a bargain at $1 billion, but massive amounts of money for the sellers in those cases. But the buyer, knocked out competitors. There's only a small handful of global competitors that have networks that big in terms of like the user size. And of course, the same thing happens at a much smaller scale. The strategic is also the guy or the company that's going to be buying the dream. That's the idea. If how much could you sell a pen for? Well, if you're selling a pen to somebody who's writing themselves $1 million contract, that pen's worth a whole lot more than a buck or getting it for free from somebody. Funding sources. Clearly, cash. A lot of companies can pay cash for a business. Loans, there's a lot of sources of financing. If you are looking to do this pretty seriously, I would encourage you to look at the SBA loan, and I can actually connect you to somebody in that office. It's not the main connection I have. Those do go through banks. Those are really frustrating. Having taken out an SBA loan in the past, I've actually done two. The paperwork is awful, but they're often the only loan that you can get, because the banks often don't do other loans because the SBA ones are guaranteed. So there's basically no risk for the bank. You would put up 5%, 10% typically, maybe a little bit more. And then the SBA covers 90%. So then the bank makes its processing fees. But the bank has to do a lot of paperwork to provide to the SBA. And that's different than the disaster relief stuff, by the by. Seller held note, as I mentioned earlier, that's fantastic. I've done this a couple times. And, there has to be a really high level of trust, of course. But if you have that, it's just way smoother. It's so much easier. There's less paperwork, of course. And it's, it's risky for the seller, but the seller does have the collateral of the business that they can recover. And then rolled equity. So if you're a big company, buy a small company, the small company gets a share of the big company. The idea here is, if you're not just like running expenses for the business, but another classic one is the owner underpays him or herself. So you're doing what's really like a $75,000, $125,000 a year job, whatever it is. You're paying yourself $30,000 or nothing at all. You look at your business, you say, oh, I'm making, it's $1 million business. I'm making $50,000 last year. Great. Well, in another sense, you're actually losing 25 if that's a $75,000 position that you're not paying yourself for. So beware of stuff like that, because it's really, really easy for you to play games with yourself. I will say that I think it's best to have an honest and upfront conversation. If there's anything about the deal that doesn't make sense to you on either side, it seems too good to be true, say, hey, this seems to be too good to be true. Often there'll be sort of missed expectations. Sometimes somebody will be trying to hoodwink you. And typically the big hot potato there can be liability. It's kind of boring. Liability is often very remote, but you can't hazard something that will cause you or the business to go bankrupt. And that's what the lawyers often hash out. And I put counsel here because they're really in my experience, they're a really, really big part of the negotiation, the key part. Like you might have, the broker might give you some advice and the broker wants to do a deal. You might have some advisor, formal or informal. The investor, of course, might have a seat at the table. But your counsel is really the one that puts pressure on you on either side to accept or reject certain things, in particular to reject unacceptable liabilities. And by the way, the lawyer can be very, very expensive. It's like they can't help themselves. And a real challenge with small business transactions is that the legal bills can easily run into the tens of thousands of dollars. So if you're doing a transaction that's worth $100,000 and the legal will be 25 or of course $70,000, it's probably not worthwhile. And that has sunk a lot of transactions. Asset versus stock is another really, really important one. Stereotypically, the buyer will want it to be an asset purchase and the seller will want it to be stock. As the seller, on a lot of occasions, I haven't really cared, but the difference is that the liability stays with you. In broad terms, liability stays with you as the stock seller. So if you sell a company shares, then the liability transfers to the buyer. So of course, the buyer typically doesn't want that. They just want the assets. So that could be software, that could be the goodwill. It's called goodwill for clients. That could be contracts, the employees, it could be physical inventory, stuff like that. So that's one to be very tuned into and also to seek, generally speaking, legal counsel But generally speaking, also, if you're the seller, you should be comfortable doing an asset sale. Now, you do still hazard stuff. And if you do this long enough, you'll probably get bit once or twice. We did an asset sale once, and there was an employee lawsuit that I had nothing to do with. It was a wrongful termination suit. I thought it was wrong. I thought the suit was totally inaccurate. But if you get sued, it's usually a shakedown, basically, from my perspective. Anyway, having been sued, the employee in question, who had been terminated by somebody else, not me, not one of the other owners, I thought didn't have a case, but we ended up settling, which was quite frustrating for me. But them's kind of the breaks, and that also, of course, can happen without a sale happening. In fact, we were really lucky because when the sale went through, there was an SBA loan involved, and whoever did the due diligence somehow missed the lawsuit, which is really bad, because they're supposed to look up if there's any legal claims filed. And it was a bullet we dodged, because the sale might have blown up, and both buyer and seller wanted that sale to go through at that point. So we had to then coordinate after the fact to deal with that lawsuit. So just be advised that sometimes that stuff, and that one was going to happen anyway. It would have happened whether or not there was a sale. So that stuff is kind of out there. It's one of the hazards of doing business. Paperwork. You generally start with a letter of intent. The letter of intent is typically non-binding, like you don't have to sell, but it often restricts the seller from shopping the business to anybody else during a restricted phase. It might be 30 days, it might be 90 days. And sometimes the buyer will really leverage that time. So I remember Amazon's infamous for doing this. If they're talking to somebody, they have this company called Quidsy, which owned diapers.com and these other companies. And while they were negotiating with them, they started to do all these pricing things to mess with the company, and they couldn't react because they were in a meeting with Amazon that later ended up buying them. So typically, I don't think you'll get muscled like that, but it is something to be aware of. Because the letter of intent also kind of typically creates a moral contract. Even if you say, oh, we'll figure out the terms later, they're largely penciled in, and the agreement largely goes by that. And finally, we come to emotions. So this is something not to overlook. And one of the things that that was really meaningful for me professionally is that I took formal sales training courses after I moved here to Austin through a company called Sandler. And David Sandler is the late founder of this. And he has all these sayings and all these rules and stuff. And a lot of them are real gems. And this is one of them. Who you are is not what you are. So it's wordplay. I think it's intentionally jarring. And the I there is identity, and the R there is role. So the idea is that your role as a human being, your identity as a human being, your core identity, is really ultimately not your role. It may feel like it is, your role as an entrepreneur or the owner of this business or the manager of this business or whatever it is, but it's not, because you might have been doing something else, probably do something else in the future, and you probably have other roles in your life that are equally or more important. Your relationship to your family, for example, maybe hobbies you have, it could be anything. And this is really, really easy to get bound up in. And I did it for long. I was very much bound up in this and very blind to it. Although at other phases of my life, I similarly bound myself up in roles when I was in college, or when I did certain athletics and stuff like that. So I was talking to my CPA once, and he shared this story of a guy he consulted for, another of his clients. And the guy had sold his business, and the guy found himself, he should just cry in the shower every day. And, he shared this with the CPA, and this hit him out of left field. It was just like this weird emotional release for him, sort of like somebody dying or some other big life event happening. And that's very, very common. And if it happens after the fact or not, you should be aware of it, because it may mean that you don't pull the trigger. So there's all these sorts of business owners who get really close to doing a deal and then pull back, to the great consternation of whoever they were talking to, and possibly also to their own detriment. Because if you're an entrepreneur, maybe your thing is to start new businesses, or maybe your thing is to have a big win and take some time off, take the rest of your life off, whatever it is. But there's a lot of stuff that gets wound up in here, and you want to try and unpack this and take inventory if you can. So another one is you're not busy anymore. You don't have control of it anymore, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe the control was a huge pain for you, and you couldn't get rid of it soon enough.